Chapter 12 of The Finding of Jasper Holt by Grace Livingston Hill. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 12. It was late when Jean awoke. The household had been quiet on her account, and breakfast was delayed. Jean came down white with her vigil, but sweet and smiling notwithstanding. The morning had brought clear vision, and she was sure now that the paper in her possession must be given to Holt and no other. She had settled so much, and would await her opportunity. This decided, her mind was at peace, and she entered the dining room with a smile of greeting for everyone. Late as it was, the master of the house had not yet appeared, and the family stood about waiting for him. But as Jean entered, the servant came in from an opposite door with his arms full of roses, and stood before her. Such roses! Jean had never seen such wealth of beauty, such luxuriance of coloring. They all exclaimed in wonder over them. Clear golden yellow, with a deep rosy tint at heart like liquid rubies spilled into them. Great heavy-headed buds and full-blown roses in abundance, many of them still on the trailing vines, as if they had been plucked with ruthless hand to offer to a queen. Their fragrance filled the room like a burst of incense from some oriental shrine. The servant laid them in her arms as though he were offering her a crown and scepter. "How wonderful!" murmured the girl, receiving them and laying her face reverently down to their exquisite beauty. "Where did they come from? Are they mine? Do they grow here?" "I found them at the door, miss," said the man respectfully. "There's only a card with your name." "Why, how strange!" said Mrs. Harrington, stepping forward to inspect the card. "Who could have sent them? I have told a number of the young men about your coming, and they are all eager to see you, but it's strange that whoever sent these beautiful roses shouldn't have given his name. They are wonderfully rare. Somebody must have squandered his month's earnings on them. They couldn't have been bought around here. I suppose they came from some florist a long way off." The discreet servant narrowed his eyes and turned away suddenly as he saw his master enter. "Look here, James, what beautiful roses someone has sent Jean. Wasn't that lovely of him, whoever he is? They were at the door when John opened it this morning, and no name on them. Who do you suppose could have sent them? Stockton Holmes, or Gartney Fowler, or even Captain Wetherill, perhaps?" But the master of the house glanced sharply at the roses, and a frown came between his brows. "There's only one place around here where roses like that grow," he announced ominously. His wife looked at him with a frightened expression. "You don't mean—" "Yes," said Harrington. "They're Holt's golden sunset." There was an ominous silence as the husband and wife looked at each other. Then Mrs. Harrington turned to her sister, who stood behind her roses with an exquisite flush on her cheeks and a soft, burning light of battle in her eyes. "Jean, did you know where they came from?" her sister asked almost haughtily. But Jean's lovely face showed no sign of intimidation as she raised it, gravely sweet, from the roses which she held as she might have held a little child. "I thought perhaps Mr. Holt sent them," she said simply. "He told me about his roses. But excuse me just a minute till I put them in water. I won't keep you waiting." When Jean returned after laying her roses tenderly in the wash bowl in her room and bending to touch her lips to their petals, there was no look on her face as if anything unusual had passed, except a kind of glorified light in her eyes. She began at once to give her sister a message from their mother, tactfully ignoring the flowers and their donor. But Harrington's set look did not relax during the entire meal. After breakfast there was the whole place to be seen, the garden, the horses, the rabbits, and the new lawn tennis court, the only one in town, where the young officers from the fort came down to play sometimes. The children came out of their shyness and adopted their new relative ecstatically, monopolizingly. They drew her down on the garden seat and plied her with questions, and they chattered away happily, feeling her hair, touching her cheek softly now and then, playing with the ribbons at her throat. "Papa's awfully angry that Jasper Holt brought you home," confided Betty. "I heard him tell Mamma he'd rather have lost $50,000 than had it happen." The color stole into Jean's cheeks, and a flash came in her eyes, but she tried to control herself. She did not want to discuss this matter with the children, and yet she felt she must be true to the man who had saved her life. "Mr. Holt was very kind to me, Betty," she said quietly. "I am sorry he's not a friend of your papa's. If he hadn't taken care of me, I would probably have drowned, and I'm sure I never would have got safely here. He was wonderful." "Jasper Holt's a bad, wicked man," said Jamie, looking at her with round eyes and a frown that was a very good imitation of his father's. He hanged a man once on a tree. Yes, he did. Tied a string round his neck and hung him up hard till he died. He's a nawful bad man. Nicky Deans told me that. My mamma don't know he told me. Nicky said not to tell. But Nicky Deans saw the tree once when he went with his papa out to the desert riding, and he heard the men tell all about it. They don't know he heard it, but he did." "I don't think much of a little boy that tells you not to tell your mother things," said Jean in a choking voice. "I don't believe I shall like Nicky Deans." "Oh, you will," said Jamie in distress for his friend. "He's a nawful nice boy. He can ride a horse just like his papa," and Jamie launched into a description of the prowess of Nicky Deans, but Jean, although she tried to smile, was not listening. Her heart was in a tumult and her eyes were full of fire and indignation. Jasper had told her about that man who hung on the tree. She knew the whole story with all its circumstances, and she knew that Nicky Deans had heard a false account of the affair. Suddenly she turned on her astonished young nephew and spoke. "Jamie," she said, looking earnestly into his big blue eyes, "Jamie, I want to tell you something. That story you heard about Mr. Holt is not true. He is not a bad man. People don't know. He is good and kind, and he has been Auntie Jean's friend. It isn't right nor fair for you to listen to stories about him. Little boys like Nicky Deans don't know about things always, and maybe they don't mean to tell what isn't true, but if you love Auntie Jean and believe she tells you what is true, you will not let anybody say bad things any more about Mr. Holt. It isn't necessary for you to talk about it at all if your papa doesn't like Mr. Holt, but you don't need to listen to unpleasant things about him. People have not understood Mr. Holt, or they would not have talked that way." Jamie looked at her with round, wondering eyes, and his paternal frown grew. He did not like to have his thrilling story spoiled by being told it was not true. But then, this new aunt had pretty eyes and a smile that was good. Besides, she had promised to tell him a story, so with mental reservations he said, "All right, I won't," and sighed to relinquish this choice bit of gossip, even during the period of his aunt's stay. It was a relief to Jean that her sister came just then and sent the children off to play, sitting down for a real visit about home and their dear ones. Finally there came a pause in their conversation about home, and the two sisters looked at each other contentedly, glad to be together again after the long separation. "Jean, dear," said Eleanor eagerly, "I hope you're going to have a lovely time while you're here. I've told every man in the region about you, and they are dying to call on you. I don't know how many have tried to bribe me to let them be first. There is no end of charming young fellows here. The post being so near brings some of them, you know, and they love to come over to our house and get a real home meal and a glimpse of something like what they are used to. There's Charlie Evans. You'll like him, I know. He's quite serious, thought of studying for the ministry at one time, but I understand he began to be rather skeptical and gave it up. You'll be just the one to do a little missionary work on him. You have great talents in that direction, I remember. Mother has been telling me what wonders you've worked in your Sunday school class at the mission. And there's Freeman Thorne. He's grave and serious enough to suit your solemnest mood. and there are scores of others. You'll have flowers and invitations more than you can attend to pretty soon. We've lots of plans made already to help you have a good time. But I want to give you a little warning, dear." A kind of constraint came in her voice. "Don't speak about Jasper Holt unless you have to, and then the very briefest word. He isn't in good repute at all. Indeed, he isn't. I understand how grateful you feel, of course. You weren't in a position to judge what kind of a fellow he was. I don't suppose one's manners would show up very badly in the woods when two people had been drowning and barely escaped with their lives. People don't think of manners at such a time." "Eleanor, he was a perfect gentleman," put in Jean indignantly. "There were lots of chances to show unrefinement, and he was a perfect gentleman every time. You don't understand, Eleanor." "Well, now, dear, you'll have to trust me a little. I know just what he is, a bad man, a really bad young man. Papa wouldn't have your name mixed up with his for anything in the world. I know you can't be convinced just now, because you've come through an unusual experience together, and I'm sure I'm glad if he was half decent. It wasn't to be expected, though that's what I've always claimed, that a really nice girl always has the upper hand of a man, even a bad man, and he dare not be rude to her. Then, of course, it was quite thoughtful of him to leave those roses the way he did and go away without any message. I'll give him credit for that. But it was most unfortunate that he should have been the one to save you. Papa would not at all approve of your having anything more to do with him whatever." "That is just what he said," said Jean quietly. "What he said!" exclaimed her sister. "Really! Then he does realize a little what people think of him. Well, that is a commendable attitude, of course, and if you think it necessary, you might write a formal little note, very brief, and thank him for bringing you home, but make him understand that he is not to presume, or if you prefer I might do it for you. On second thought, I think mamma would prefer that It is not in the least necessary, Eleanor. I have thanked Mr. Holt already, and he understands perfectly that it would not be agreeable to you to have him come here. You said you had sewing to do. Don't you want me to help you with something? I'd love to." There was a dignity in the set of the head and a firm curve of lip that made Mrs. Harrington survey her young sister with wonder and silence as they arose and went toward the house. The way Jean had set aside the topic of young Holt was masterly. Mrs. Harrington had not said nearly all she meant to say on the subject, but somehow she did not see the way clear to open the subject again at present. She looked at Jean uneasily from time to time as they sat together in the house, or went from room to room, flying from one topic to another as people will do who have been long separated. 3 distinct times did Mrs. Harrington essay to give an extended dissertation on the evil deeds and reputation of Jasper Holt, and each time the subject was as summarily closed and quietly set aside by Jean as if she had no interest whatever in the young man. It gave the woman almost an uncanny feeling, and actually disturbed her seriously, so that she was threatened with one of her nervous headaches. And after lunch, having had to confess to her husband that she had made no headway in doing his bidding about enlightening her sister with regard to his enemy, she retired to her darkened room to sleep. Jean, glad of escape to quiet, fled to her roses. Broodingly, as a mother would touch her little child while it sleeps, Jean hovered over those flowers. The door was locked safe from intrusion, and the children sent to a neighbor's that the house might be quiet. She drew the little table near the great window chair, and placed the bowl of roses upon it. They filled the bowl, lying heavy-headed in great sheaves over its rim on their cool, luscious leaves, those leaves of that peculiar green touched with burnt sienna on tips and veins, that speak of a high state of cultivation and rare stock. She laid her cheek against the cool yellow of the flowers, then her lips, then her closed eyelids, while she let her thoughts rove back to the yesterday and the time when their giver had been at her side. The words he had spoken, the way he had looked, the sound of his voice, and the firm clasp of his hand. It all rushed over her in a tumult of joy and sorrow. This was the man she knew, so kind, so tender, so strong, so true, and that other was the one they thought he was. She could never feel that way about him, no matter what people told her, for she had seen what they had not. If they had been there in her place, and he had been that strong companion and friend, they might have understood. She would, of course, respect their wishes, and not do anything to trouble those who loved her, but she would trust him always. And now there stirred in her mind the remembrance of that paper, the disposition of which she must decide at once. How should she get it to him? It would not do to send for him. He could not, probably would not, come if she did. Even a letter which did not explain too much would be a difficult thing to manage, at least until she knew the way to the post office and could mail it herself. If it were carried by a servant or a member of the family, it might be subject to inspection. Yet the paper ought to go to him at once. Still, of course, in her keeping it was at least out of his enemies' hands, if enemies they were, these dear people of her own family. Oh, why were things at once so bitter and so sweet in this hard, bright world? She buried her face in the roses again, and let their sweetness rush over her. As she did so, a slight rustling sound startled her, and when she lifted up her face and then pressed it close again, she heard it once more. Curious, with a wild fleeting hope floating through her brain, she sat up and began to touch the buds and blossoms softly, eagerly, searchingly with her fingers. Yes, there it was, that sound of crackling paper. She folded back the petals of the largest bud, and there, laid deftly in like another flower leaf, she found a tiny bit of folded paper. Eagerly she took it out and opened it, for it was very thin and folded close, and there was writing small and fine, but boldly, distinctly clear. I have to go away. For how long I do not know. I shall not forget my promise. You may trust me. I hope you have a happy time. The tears were in her eyes as she read the brief message over and over again, and laid her lips upon it. Bright drops fell upon the roses and stood like dewdrops. She searched the other blossoms carefully, but there were no more messages, and she had known there would not be. He would not think it square to write more of the things that were in his heart, and she loved him the more for his sense of honor toward her. Then she remembered the water contract. Now what would she do with the paper? She could not give it to him while he was away. It might await his return and be lost if she trusted it to the mail. She must wait for a few days and see if he came back, and meantime she would listen and watch as far as it lay in her power, that no harm came near his rights. If worst came to worst, she would confide in her father. He was wise, and he would understand. He would feel as she did about this matter if he knew all. The difficulty would be to make him know all through the medium of a mere letter. But for the present she would wait. A sense of desolation settled down upon her when she realized that Holt was gone away. Yet she was at peace about it. At least she need not always be fearing lest her relatives should be unpleasant to him, or that embarrassing circumstances might arise where she would be obliged to choose between her sense of loyalty to her lover and her sense of loyalty to her relatives in whose home she was a guest. But for a little time she put away these thoughts and let her happy heart dwell on the fact that he had sent these glorious roses with their secret message. And finally she lay down for a rest and slept, with one great yellow bud nestled against her cheek. End of chapter 12.